During the beginning of World War II, the United States decided not to intervene militarily in the conflict, but it did apply a harsh commercial blockade against several countries, especially Japan, a nation which it hit with an oil embargo. These decisions led to Japan launching a brutal surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which pushed the Americans to go to war against the Japanese and the entire Axis. Between 1940 and 1942, the Empire of Japan expanded rapidly throughout the Pacific, and the Japanese Royal Navy, under the command of Admiral Yamamoto, behaved like an unstoppable tsunami that devastated all possible defenses planned by the Americans, who came to battles terrified, since the passion of the kamikazes frightened even the most experienced captains. This was particularly demonstrated in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first time in history that two carrier fleets came face to face. For the United States, this conflict was the beginning of its recovery in the Pacific, although the strategic victory cost its two most important aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington and, worse still, the USS Yorktown. But Japan's defeat, which also involved the loss of two aircraft carriers and a large part of its air force, was a stain on the impeccable honor of Yamamoto, who was highly questioned after these events. The Japanese couldn't afford to lose any more ground, so they decided to set a trap for the Americans. Thus they organized Operation MI, named after the Midway Islands, an atoll belonging to the United States, located in the North Pacific, between Tokyo and Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's plan was to deceive the Americans. A part of the Japanese fleet would attack the Aleutian Islands, in a clear gesture to draw the attention of the United States Navy. Once the Americans met the Japanese Navy, the rest of Yamamoto's forces would encircle their enemies, replicating the surprise attack that had led to their landslide victory at Pearl Harbor. Operation MI sought to be a coup de grace against the U.S. fleets, in addition to representing the possibility for Admiral Yamamoto to recover his honor. The objective of the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy was to destroy as many American aircraft carriers as possible, an urgency that increased considerably after the Americans bombed several coastal cities in Japan, including Tokyo. This audacity left the imperial government in a very bad position, especially Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Nagumo, who were considered the political leaders of the country against Emperor Hirohito. The North American fleet in the Pacific had to fall, and there was no margin for error. However, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Navy was unaware of a fact that put his entire plan in jeopardy. The United States intelligence services had been working for the previous 6 months on breaking the encrypted communication codes of the Japanese naval forces. And they had succeeded. Thanks to this, the American sailors managed to intercept a communication in which a certain plan was specified that required creating a distraction to ambush the U.S. Navy at a strategic point, called AF. Of course, the Americans did not know what the place was since it was a code, but they suspected that it could be in the Midway Islands. As a result of this, they decided to set a trap for the Japanese. They sent a bogus message from Midway to Pearl Harbor, claiming that due to a breakdown in their sewage treatment plants, they only had a few days' supply of water left. A short time later, the Americans intercepted a coded message from the Japanese, which read A.F is short of water. In this way, they managed to confirm the setting for the ambush. At the same time, another surprise awaited Yamamoto, who was confident that the Americans had two fewer aircraft carriers. The USS Yorktown had been repaired and was in service, a fact completely unknown to the Japanese. Under this context, both sides got ready for a double ambush. Before continuing, we want to introduce you to our new channel, Military Aviation. Here we'll explore the extraordinary world of combat aircraft and the latest developments of the world's most important air forces, as well as the most incredible air missions of today. You'll find the link to subscribe in the description of the video and in the first comment. On July 4, 1942, at 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched his first attack on Midway, with a force of 108 bombers, while 6 reconnaissance planes took off to search for the enemy fleet accompanied by several Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, which were to patrol the airspace surrounding the area. It was these pilots who noticed something strange. In the distance, they could see a large U.S. naval force that was not supposed to be in that location as planned. The reconnaissance squadron immediately alerted Nagumo, who was faced with a dilemma: either heed his airmen and change strategy to engage the U.S. fleet, or continue the attack as planned. Despite being advised by his men to launch a second attack on the Americans, Nagumo preferred to wait for the bombardment of Midway to end. This decision cost him the battle. The American counterattack was immediate, and the aircraft carriers USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, and USS Enterprise launched an all-out offensive against their Japanese counterparts. Waves of slow Douglas TBD Devastator bombers began to fly over the Japanese ships, although all were destroyed. However, the defense cost the Imperial Navy its strategic position, as they had to circle to avoid the American planes, at the same time that most of the Mitsubishi Zero fighters ran out of ammunition and fuel reserves. Consequently, Nagumo's carriers were left unescorted and totally unprotected. A second American attack came at this time, dealing a brutal blow against the Japanese, whose reserve planes were still on the takeoff deck, preparing to counterattack. By 10 a.m., U.S. aircraft were already shelling the Kaga and Akagi aircraft carriers, critical to the Japanese Navy. The attack was devastating. Although it lasted only 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were out of action, some with major damage, others completely sunk. The only remaining ship, the Hiryu, counterattacked the USS Yorktown, which was damaged, but thanks to an enormous effort it was repaired within an hour. Nagumo's sailors didn't have that impressive replenishment capability, so seeing the repaired Yorktown, they thought it was the USS Enterprise, and attacked her again. This allowed the real Enterprise to launch an offensive that destroyed the Hiryu, the last active aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost all 4 of its carriers, along with a cruiser, a destroyer, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 lives. On the opposite side, the Americans suffered the loss of 307 men, in addition to an aircraft carrier, a destroyer and 150 aircraft. This left the Empire of Japan with a skeleton fleet commanded by 2 remaining aircraft carriers, halting its expansion into the Pacific and marking a turning tide in the war, allowing the Americans to push closer and closer to the shores of Tokyo. After this new defeat, American ships will hardly dare to face the Japanese fleet again. With this phrase, Adolf Hitler referred to the Battle of the Coral Sea, magnifying the figure of his Japanese allies. This carrier battle was part of a series of crushing victories achieved by the Japanese Empire in the early months of the Pacific Theater. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, which today is remembered as a mistake that brought the United States into the war, the advance of the Eastern forces was basically unstoppable for the Americans. The Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and much of New Guinea fell to the Empire of the Rising Sun in a few months. Although the Battle of the Coral Sea was a new Japanese victory, there was a serious mistake by the Japanese High Command that had, in hindsight, a very high price and, in the long run, the result of the battle led to enormously favorable consequences for the Allies. But how did this confrontation unfold, and what was the huge Japanese mistake? In the next few minutes we will tell you all about the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first aircraft carrier battle in history. Are you ready? Let's get started. In early 1942, after a string of resounding victories that allowed the Japanese Empire to take over much of the Far East, Japanese generals began to have a series of discussions about what their forces should target next. Some indicated India or Australia, while others even suggested going all the way to Hawaii. Finally, after 2 weeks of deliberation and seeking not to lose momentum, they decided to invade Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, and then continue with Samoa, Fiji, and New Caledonia. With this intention, they launched Operation Mach, which consisted of landing troops in Port Moresby, completely taking over New Guinea and in turn putting Australia at risk. Under the command of Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, the Japanese forces assembled 23 ships for this operation, including 3 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, 7 destroyers, 7 submarines and an oil tanker, in addition to 147 aircraft as an embarked air fleet. For their part, the Allies managed to intercept and decipher several enemy messages to learn of the offensive in time. Although the location of the attack was not specified, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the U.S. Far East Fleet, deduced that Port Moresby was the logical target. To combat the Japanese advance, they also gathered 23 ships, 21 American and 2 Australian. Among these were 2 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and an oil tanker. Regarding the embarked aviation, 36 fighters, 22 torpedo boats and 70 bombers were mobilized, for a total of 128 planes. During the first days of May, the two forces and their aircraft searched extensively at sea, without crossing paths, despite being only 100 kilometers apart at one point. Finally, on the morning of May 7, in the Coral Sea, the battle began. Almost simultaneously, aircraft from both sides detected enemy boats. Japan attacked first, with 10 precise 250-kilogram bombs completely destroying a destroyer and the oil tanker. In response, U.S. bombers managed to shoot down 5 enemy planes and subsequently sink a Japanese light aircraft carrier. This first part of the battle continued with Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber attacks that failed to cause significant damage to the American fleet. On the contrary, the Allies managed to shoot down at least 5 of these planes with their anti-aircraft guns. During the night of that same day and in the middle of a violent storm, 27 Japanese planes led by the most experienced pilots in night operations were sent to attack the enemy forces. 20 of these were lost, either destroyed by the Americans or crashed while attempting to land. The next morning, the fighting resumed. Both parties quickly located each other thanks to the work of their planes. Around 120 ships took off from each side's aircraft carriers. This was an extremely messy fight riddled with tactical errors. As this was the first carrier battle in history and the first naval engagement where the ships did not see their enemies directly, lack of experience played a big role. Many aircraft lost their comrades and then made staggered or isolated bombing raids, attacking many ships simultaneously, which greatly undermined the effectiveness of the offensives. Despite this, the Japanese attacks managed to be considerably more incisive, causing the main American aircraft carrier to sink. At the end of this new day, the United States and the Allies were left in a position of extreme inferiority, disordered and without any relevant unit to face the invaders. It seemed that Operation MO would be a new success for the Japanese Empire. However, that day fate smiled on the Americans. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue made a huge mistake. Believing that the Americans were far more numerous and powerful than they actually were at the time, he ordered a retreat into Micronesia, calling off the operation for fear of defeat. In short, the Battle of the Coral Sea left Japan with a balance of a light aircraft carrier sunk, more than 900 dead and at least 77 aircraft shot down. For their part, the Allies lost a destroyer, an oil tanker, a modern aircraft carrier, 70 aircraft and 660 men. Although the confrontation was a new blow to the expectations of the American fleet that once again showed serious flaws in organization and effectiveness, the result was incredibly positive in perspective, since they managed to avoid the fall of Port Moresby. As usual, both sides claimed victory. The New York Times even announced that more than 75% of the Japanese ships present in the battle were sunk or damaged, while the Japanese press spoke of the panic present in the U.S. Navy. Shortly after, the Japanese Empire made a land attack to conquer Port Moresby that would lead to the Battle of Kokoda Road, in which the Allied forces prevailed. At the same time, the ability to intercept enemy codes and messages would remain a constant that was absolutely critical to the United States, not just this time, but throughout the war, and especially in a very close and momentous engagement, the Battle of Midway. There, the United States would demonstrate how wrong Hitler was with his statements after the combat in the Coral Sea. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think that if Japan had not made this huge mistake, the result of the war in the Pacific would have been different, or in any way the United States would emerge victorious? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.